the extractive economy has accelerated. That has created more billionaires than we've ever seen. But at the same time, the relative scale of well-being of everyday ordinary people is decreasing rapidly. So we're in a place now where for the first time, future generations don't think their lives will be better than ours. So we see that emerging as a critical strand of support in regenerative work, wherever it is you're working, is how do we find processes that help people to deal with that radical complexity in increasingly polarized environments in which we are trying to make a leap across an ontological threshold into a new and different way of seeing the world.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on this episode, I'm joined by Jenny Andersson, a regenerative strategist that's behind the Really Regenerative Centre out of the UK, who is dedicated to facilitating the emergence of a regenerative economy. We're at an interesting time in the movement of regeneration. There is clearly momentum with more and more people and organizations desperately wanting to be purposeful and impactful with their work. As we crest the peak of the dominant system, there are clear signs of instability and collapse. Simultaneously, though, a groundswell is happening. An emergent field is beginning to form that will continue to gain momentum as the old system sputters out. When one system dies, a new one emerges. And unfortunately, it can feel quite tumultuous while this is going on. That's why, with the state of the world as it is, I can sometimes feel overwhelmed by my desire to be a regenerative change agent. I've read many of the leading regenerative theory and philosophy books. I've taken courses and sat in communities and circles. You can even hear me get tongue-tied and mentally twisted with guests that come onto this show. That's because there's this element of regeneration that is pedantic to me. Frameworks, theories, systems, principles, it can all be pretty overwhelming. Just before recording this, I was looking at a website a colleague shared with me that many quote-unquote regenerative organizations were listed. When I would click on the individual websites, I couldn't help but feel these conflicting emotions of both intrigue and confusion. In one sense, it seems like there is incredible work taking place. But in another, I was left with a deep sense of confusion about what on earth the organization is actually doing. I've come to realize that we need guides in this work. Guides that aren't just trying to disrupt the patterns of our thinking, but to put them back together and make us feel capable, strong, and motivated. We need to be able to move theory into practice, create clarity of purpose and process. We need to create companies, projects, and brands that resonate with wider audiences. And we need kids' books on regeneration, not just dense philosophy books. That's why I wanted to invite our guest, Jenny Andersson, onto the show. Jenny has worked with some of the world's largest corporations and iconic brands. It wasn't until her own personal catastrophe that she knew she needed to make a change and align her life and her work with a deeper purpose. She's gone on to found the Really Regenerative Centre and is a sought-after thought leader, speaker, and consultant that is helping organizations, companies, and municipalities begin to make this shift into the regenerative economy. Jenny, it's a pleasure to have you on here. It was funny because a mentor and friend of ours, Peter Block, forwarded me one of your newsletters, and it was just another gentle prod of the universe saying, you should really reach back out to Jenny and see what she's got going on, because I know that you're also quite involved, or at least fluent, and have a good relationship with leaders and teachers of ours, from Carol Sanford to Pamela Mang and Bill Reed. But you just happen to be on another continent. And so where are you calling in from?
So I'm calling in from a small village in West Sussex, which is southwest of London, called Midhurst. And mostly nobody's ever heard of Midhurst unless you happen to be really interested in polo, because it's the home of British polo. It is also the home of the South Downs National Park Authority, which is our local national park. And I live right in the middle of it, obviously. And I'm really lucky that literally 2 to 3 minutes out of my door, I'm on open pathways and bridle paths, and I can walk out every day into pretty unpopulated nature, particularly going up the South Downs escarpment, which is quite wooded for this part of the world, despite the continuous increase of the built environment, and spend plenty of time sitting watching deer, of which we've got high populations here, or badgers or red kites. And so we've got a lot of bird life slowly coming back, which is great. And in the summer, particularly when everybody decamps on holiday, I'm the only one left behind. So I have it all to myself, which is wonderful. Not that I'm antisocial at all. But it is a particular privilege to spend time on your own in nature, in silence with nature, I think, particularly given the challenging nature of the work that we sometimes do in the regenerative field. Mm-hmm. Peter Block, you mentioned, is, I'm a huge fan of Peter's work, and also Adrienne Murray Brown, who's also in your neck of the woods. And there's something that is really important to me in regenerative work, which doesn't really matter whether you're in the built environment, food systems change, community work, which is how to be in right relationship and how to convene fields of energy and stakeholder groups, to use an old word, together in right relationship to do this work. And I think Peter is an absolute master of that art, as indeed is Adrienne Murray Brown. And I've drawn really heavily from both their works in that, one of my, shall we say, theories of change is that you actually have to start this work by looking internally and at yourself, and do the work on yourself first. And then you have to be in right relationship with others before you actually start thinking about evolving the systems and places in which we sit. And I really feel that as we step into, let's call it, designing regenerative cultures or places for life, we really need to do that work on us messy humans as a priority. How do we work in right relationship with each other in an increasingly polarized cultural environment?
Well, I'd love to back up, because I actually see a lot of parallels between you and Peter, doing preparation and homework to have a conversation with you, because you both come out of the corporate world, so to speak. But I don't want to tell your story. I'd actually love to fill in a lot of the gaps here, because I also don't think that we can just all of a sudden proclaim ourselves to be regenerative experts and be able to change the way that we have a relationship with our place, or with our economy, or with our companies. So I'd love to start just at whatever the genesis point that you think is a good place to launch into the work that you're doing now.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot of things in a person's life that I think go towards bringing them to a point where they begin to explore what the regenerative field might be. So mine, because I'm older than most people, was probably a longer journey than most people. But I actually started out in life in international development. I married a quantum physicist, which is also pertinent, and lived in Sweden for 5 years. And while I was there, I was working for the government of Tanzania, helping bilateral aid arrive in Tanzania and a variety of different projects. And it was a really salutary 5 years because I guess it was the first point that I learned that existing systems didn't actually generate the outcome that they were designed to achieve. So when I looked at international aid, I could see it was doing very good work, but still not passing power, empowerment, or agency to the places that it was there to help. So keeping them locked in to a particular process of investing funds and money in different projects that didn't seem to succeed in the long term for whatever reasons. And at the end of that sort of very short period of time, I came back to the UK and thought, didn't know, what am I going to do now? This hasn't quite worked out as I anticipated. And purely by accident, fell into brand strategy and communications. I didn't have any idea what it was as a field, but very quickly, by luck or judgment, turned out I wasn't too bad at the whole thing. But I was working for a big multinational agency, and I think I probably was always not designed to work for large organizations directly because it felt quite constraining to me. And so I sort of left and set up my own venture in the mid to late 80s. My first client was Patagonia, who were coming into Europe at the time. And, Patagonia are, quite revered in terms of consumer brands for the way in which they have been working. And I carried on doing that, working with some really interesting companies, mainly names that you'd recognize, people like Timberland or Nike, over a couple of decades. And interestingly, over that period of time, I guess you describe our client base changed from really pioneering organizations like Virgin, like Timberland, like Patagonia, who were looking at the potential of either corporate social responsibility or sustainability strategies to have an impact, positive impact on environment or social justice, to coming into the start of this century, which always sounds mad to say, trying to help organizations like Levi's or Cargill turn around their failing strategies to sort of shift them even slightly towards what was sustainable. And really, I think it was at the start of this century as you could start to see planetary boundaries being pushed. And even though they weren't being really expressed by the Stockholm Resilience Institute in the early part of this century in 2000s, you could see the direction of the way the wind was blowing with IPCC reports. So I was starting to feel uncomfortable about the way where my work was going. And then one of those things happens that suddenly gives you a window of opportunity, which was being diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma in 2006, which, stage 4 is bad news. It's, almost like curtains, but it gave me a couple of years out in treatment where I could actually really concentrate on the question of what other approaches are there out there than sustainability that might be commensurate with the patterns that we can see coming towards us through climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, all of those good things. And I guess it took another 10 years until the Sustainable Development Goals were launched in 2015 to go on what I call now my informal PhD, which was a ridiculous exploration of many different things, from developmental psychology to evolutionary biology, studying with the Biomimicry Institute, looking at systems thinking, design thinking, and deeply looking at participatory process, deep democracy. So it was a long period of really trying to work out what is the art of the possible and what's my work for the years that I've got left. And I'm a bit slow, so it took me a lot longer than it takes most people, I think. But I did finally really land on, mainly because of my growing understanding, of life's processes, that it would be from place, which was a slightly challenging conclusion to reach, given that the vast majority of my connections, my experience had been in global strategy and business. So it was, if you like, my third career reinvention to then ask myself the question, well, how are you going to do this? What is this going to look like? Yeah, at the end of, I'd say, 10 to 12 year learning journey. And then another sort of disaster struck, where the farm that I had been living on, which was boundaried by a river, on one Christmas Eve, the patterns of the weather, the patterns of the land, the patterns of flooding had been changing. And we'd had a particularly wet winter. And the river burst its banks on 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve. And 1 minute it was at my ankles, and the next minute it was kind of coming up towards my middle. And in those kind of severe flooding circumstances, you learn a great deal about yourself, because I lost everything that I had. You know, you find when everything, your home floats away and your beloved animals float away, you get to about the lowest possible point you can. And there are choices in front of you. You either choose not to continue or you find a way. And it was at that moment that somebody really kindly put Joanna Macy's beautiful book, Active Hope, in my hand. And that, I guess, was the start, 2013, of the decision to really find a way to work with systems evolution, systems change. I call it evolution rather than change, from place. And that's been my work ever since.
What strikes me is that there's so many different words and vocabulary and from biomimicry to living systems, to be able to bring that together and to say, this is my offering to the world, and this is how I'm going to show up and create frameworks and common language. What did that initially look like for you? Was it something that you knew was going to be more consultative, or was it you were thinking of creating a charity or a company? What were those early, how do we reconcile all these different fields?
That's a really good question. And we're a work in progress to answer that question. And I think that we all are. But I'd say I started really early to experiment with themes that I thought might be important. And one of those first themes was, what are the root causes of the disruption that we are seeing in our ecological systems that is also spilling over into our economic and cultural systems? Where did that come from? And it's easy to go to what you know first. So because you spend a lot of work on imagination when you're doing brand strategies, I probably started to look at that first as, are we in a crisis of imagination? Is it simply that we cannot imagine another world other than neoliberal economics and market and capitalism and constant growth? Is that the source of this challenge? And experimented with that for a little while and quickly realized, no, it's a symptom. It's not the core source of what our challenges are, but that probably eventually slightly reached a conclusion with the help of many people. Probably the source of those interconnecting crises was the way in which we perceive how the world works versus how it does actually work. So I shifted then away from imagination as a root cause and something to work with, more towards, what could engage communities, stakeholder groups in conversations about the future, where it would be implicit through an experience that the systems that we perceived to be separate problems were in fact all interconnected. I thought that would be a good way to begin. So back in 2019, we we started thinking about, well, what would be the right process, the right way in which to experiment with that thinking, or to test it out and see if it was even a theory of change. We were applying for funding to run a series of dialogues and inquiries based on Cape Rawa's donut in about 40 different towns and villages in our geography, which we thought, okay, inquiry is going to be a good route, bringing people together in open inquiry about questions about how they perceive the challenges of the places that they inhabit, and getting into collective inquiry about the future would be a good starting point. And we were literally just starting that project, which was a 2-year project, in March 2020. And we all know what happened in March 2020. The world came to a very sudden and grinding halt. So the way in which we originally perceived we would work, which was very much as a backbone organization in a particular geography, was suddenly very much knocked on the head because there was no funding around at that point in time. And we'd set up as a community interest company without any significant funding. It was all going into COVID disaster relief, quite right too. That's what had to happen at that point in time. So we did what in enterprise terms you'd call a bit of a pivot, and we brought forward the learning journeys, the education part of our work that we always knew would be part of what we wanted to do in parallel with community and place-based inquiry. And because of COVID at the time, that really took off. And the first of our signature learning journey, Power of Place, started in very early 2021, which is a 3-phase exploration of how do we re-understand our relationship with place differently? How do we engage in right relationship with nature, with ourselves and with each other? Again, coming back to Peter Block's work, I source a lot of inspiration from Peter, from Adrienne Murray Brown, from Deep Democracy, from Participatory Process. And then how, with those 2 building blocks, do we actually design, if design is possible, systems evolution from place? How do we actually design projects with that new understanding of place and how to build right relationship, how to bring fields into being, if you like, which are always there anyway, but convene to design change. So that started in 2021 and has continued twice a year since then. We've actually only done 1 this year. We won't do 2 because life evolves and we need to redesign it again. And then eventually, as COVID started to dissipate, we started working once again in partnership with place-based organizations.
Before we continue this episode, I want to talk about the tremendous potential embedded within the real estate industry to create life-giving communities and thriving habitats. The hard part, though, is that development is complex and requires specialized knowledge around design, planning, capital and investment, community engagement, and construction. That's why at Latitude Regenerative Real Estate, our work goes to serve those that seek to create projects that strengthen communities and develop ecological resilience. We work with developers and landowners to bring purpose-driven projects to life. So when you are ready to leave a legacy and need an experienced team that knows how to create successful projects, I encourage you to reach out to us by visiting our website at chooselatitude.com. Shana, I'd love to hear some of the things that came out of that work, especially during COVID, because it's quite challenging to work digitally. There was a time in there that I think COVID, we were all, I think, hoping that it would have this lasting impression of rethinking how we relate to ourselves and how we want to operate. But it seems like the throttle has been really pushed down since then, especially because of just how expensive it is to keep a roof over our head and food on our plates. But I'm curious, like keeping that in mind of where we are now, but the things that's really come out of your work over the last couple of years.
Wow. Another huge question. Let's start with your first observation is what we have noticed over the years, and I'll just specifically talk about Power of Place as a program rather than our direct work in place, is unquestionably you can see the pattern of going back to system as usual. It increases year by year by year. And how that manifests in the cohorts that join us, who are incredibly bright people, very committed, all in interesting and pivotal positions of place from academia to councils and municipalities, national parks, built environment, is an increasing inability to cope with complexity. So not only is system as usual always there at the shoulders of people, and this is such a leap across an ontological threshold. It's much bigger than any we have, I think, as a species done before. So it is a constant practice to make sure you are not every single day and every single moment falling back into our habitual way of thinking, our mechanistic way of thinking, our unright relationship way of being with each other. That is a constant challenge. But at the same time, the intersecting crises are speeding up and complexity, therefore, is speeding up. And that is, one of the outcomes of that is putting people into something of a freeze zone. So one of the really important things is communities of practice and communities of place that can provide the cultural scaffolding and support for people doing regenerative work in the field to be almost like, a co-mutual group of people who are there to support you on this journey when the going gets tough, and it, like a solidarity crew. So, that freeze and overwhelm is showing up in right across the regenerative field in many different ways, and, across all sectors. It is clearly not helped by, again, the acceleration of polarity in society. Since probably 2008, I think it would be fair to say, in Western cultures anyway, since the financial crisis of 2008, even though it might not have been really obvious, the extractive economy has accelerated. That has created more billionaires than we've ever seen, more multimillionaires than we've ever seen. But at the same time, the relative scale of well-being of everyday ordinary people is decreasing rapidly. So we're in a place now where for the first time, future generations don't think their lives will be better than ours, which is a very sobering and sad place to be. So we see that emerging as a critical strand of support in regenerative work, wherever it is you're working, is how do we find processes that help people to deal with that radical complexity in increasingly polarized environments where system as usual is still hanging on there. It's a living system. It doesn't want to die, doesn't want to go quietly, where everyday pressures are like paying the bills, getting the kids to school, being in cultural, politicized, polarized environments is restricting people's abilities to even have ordinary conversations in the street with neighbors where things are increasingly politicized. And also, I do believe that the human body and the human spirit and soul senses into the systems creaking around it, the life support systems, the, plastic micropollution in waterways, increasing soil ill health, consumption of food that is by and large increasingly produced with chemical support flown miles around the world. The body keeps the score, it knows. And people are sensing into our creaking economic, cultural, and ecological systems. And that is raising an invisible and hard to track culture of fear. So there is a perfect storm, if you like, brewing, in which we are trying to make a leap across an ontological threshold into a new and different way of seeing the world. And at the same time, trying to redesign the plane while it's flying in the air without it falling out of the air. And the plane is our economic systems that underpin the way in which we live alongside a concurrent crisis in human health, both mental and physical. So I'm not painting a very pretty picture. But I guess it isn't all that pretty.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I'm like, oh my word, this is like the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up, because it's a lived experience as well. And I think if you embrace wanting to be a catalyst and a change agent, that you are confronted with this on a daily basis, and even trying to hold the mental models of what a living system is, for example, is quite challenging. It's also quite academic. A lot of the rhetoric around regeneration has been very academic, and I think the will is there, but it's also hard for people to. And I'm going to kind of go off script here, not point fingers at anybody, but when people are reacting to this force, like they're saying we need to do something right now because things are not going in a very good way. And they come into the field of regeneration and they're realizing like we need to disrupt the patterns of our thinking. What I'm finding is that it's challenging to disrupt and then put back together while there's still lots of disturbance going on. And so where do we go from here on the regeneration side is kind of the big question mark that I have. Of a lot of people are compelled. There's a lot of worries around regen washing, greenwashing type of things. But it's still this practice of we need to reimagine, redesign the way that we're thinking.
I think you're touching on something that is really critical. There's no silver bullet answer, but one of the things that is constantly prevalent with us in this journey is paradox, or maybe we might call it double binds. So for every possible pathway we could take, there's an opposite tension. So if we think about the language of regeneration, when you're really trying to change culture or change the paradigm of thought, one of the things that you can do to support that leap is to use completely different language, because it paints a different territory, but it's also can be experienced as being excluding if it's not accessible and easy to understand, and you have to really burn your brain cells to understand what the hell people are talking about. And there is a constant scream in my ear across all different sectors in which I work for, but can't you just make this simple? And I totally understand that desire, because I express it myself many times, and I have on my journey, but can't you just make this more accessible? Can't you just make it simple? But actually, complex adaptive systems are not simple. They are complex. So there is a degree of having to commit to learning to work and dance with complexity that we have to do. But there are So there's a tension there. Do we simplify to bring people with us? Or do we say, well, this is complex work, so you have to learn to dance with what is complex. So there's real tension there, which means that as a regenerative practitioner, you have to be really clear about what your work is and who and where your work is with. If you really want to focus on 100% on building a regenerative future, and you are able to do that because you have funding, resource, courage to be right on the edge of that transformation, you can stay with that degree of complexity. If your work, however, is trying to redesign the plane while it's still flying, and you're working with the current system to find pathways and bridges that enable that system to step in some way into a regenerative future, then there is perhaps what might feel to some regenerative practitioners a degree of compromise involved in the approach in order to bring parts of system as is on board. But it's really, I believe, the individual or the individual organization's choice to determinedly work out what is my work and where is my work. And there's another really deep underlying question that goes with answering or finding somehow an answer to that, which is, do I accept collapse as a fact? And therefore, is my work to build as much resilience as possible into existing systems for when collapse might come? Or do I accept that collapse might come, but till my last breath, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to mitigate the deep, painful effects of collapse, which is, effectively already happening all around the world. And that also is an underlying question you have to answer that helps you determine what and where your work is. So I probably would describe the work of Really Regenerative as being on both those levels. So our learning and development, our open learning journeys are really very much about capacity building for people who are in system as usual, but deeply want to shift to what is regenerative, want to build their own capacity and skills and ability to do that. Many of whom make a choice to, or are able to make a choice to work wholly in the field of building the third horizon, the regenerative horizon. But many are not. Many, for very many different factors of cultural scaffolding, might be in a job with a big fat mortgage and 3 kids and, have to stay put or feel that they have to stay put. There are lots of reasons why people continue to work in system as is from within to try to create change, as many reasons as there are for those people who say, we have to abandon this design and build the new. And I personally don't try really hard not to bring any judgment into the choices people make around that, because they are very, dependent on the cultures in which you live and your individual circumstances and ability. One of the things that we're doing at the moment, we're working on a study that is looking at what is the potential for philanthropic funders if they were to release their endowment to have a catalytic impact on community-led, place-based regenerative work, from the fractal of neighborhood across to the bioregional scale. And one of the things that is really very, very obvious in the field is, which is not a surprise if you tend to know how new culture emerges, is those people who are by and large right at the edge of bringing regenerative futures into being are woefully underfunded or they bring their own personal wealth to it and expend their own personal wealth until they're at a point of bankruptcy. And all of them, by and large, are often on a constant roller coaster of burnout, lack of funding, lack of resource. So one of I think the critical things we have to be thinking about is how do we transfer wealth, of which there is all different forms of wealth, across into this work to support the people who are really on the edge of change and help them avoid burnout, but also help them to be more effective and influential in their work, which many of them can be, but they just simply lack the resource. They lack the illumination of the work that is being done. There is so much work in the regenerative field that is not regen washing, that does not see the light of day because most media systems are business as usual focus. They're also not well networked together. You know, there is a huge piece of work that the regenerative field, again, if it had the right resources to do, about connecting across the whole world, as well as across different fractals of place, different scales of work, that could be done if it were funded properly, if not everybody were running around chasing the next funding application, you know, which is always never enough. But there are some real systemic traps in this transition. One of which, you know, we've touched on is language. Another is funding. Another is capability building. You know, when you're in the regenerative field, you have a tendency to think like, well, surely everybody knows about the potential of what regenerative economic design or cultural design is by now. But realistically, it's still tiny. It's seeds that are growing. It's merely that a number of fairly large corporations have, because they're always looking for future trends, have seen it emerging over the COVID years and gone, oh, look, yeah, we'll grab that, slap it on our brand, she said, trying not to mention any, and say we're part of the regenerative movement, which, you know, perhaps they are. If they're food brands, they're shifting towards regenerative agriculture. But if they're still squeezing farmers for every last penny of profit, they're not in a regenerative space. They're just shifting their purchase from non-organic or non-regeneratively farmed crops to regeneratively farmed crops, but they haven't applied the same principles to their economic business models and relationships.
I love regenerative agriculture. I think it was the first thing that really introduced me to this concept. And I might have said this on this podcast before, but it seems like the way that industry is going is, let's pat ourselves on the back by replacing a regular Cheeto with a regenerative Cheeto and call it good. Of like, we've changed maybe we've moved animals across the landscape a little bit faster than what we would have done normally. I do want to go back to touch on something, and I might have just sent us off in a wildly different direction. But you mentioned philanthropic capital being a catalyst. And this is the world in which we sit in a lot, because the potential that we saw for real estate or property to be the way in which we can relate to our places and what our roles are. Like that, I saw the industry in which we are working in as holding so much potential, because it's how we steward our home and our community and relate to other people. But the further that we've gone into this, the more and more we've had to pay very close attention with capital and finance, because they're intricately interwoven in the way in which we've created our modern society. And this is where I have deep curiosity right now, because we are challenged to not just use the financing sources that we know how to, the debt instruments of debt, but also break that of we need to distribute equity and power. And that is part philanthropic, but also I look at this, how philanthropic pales in comparison to the for-profit realm of capital seeking a return, seeking areas that needs to get invested into. And so this is currently the place that I'm sitting in now of like, we need fluency in both, but how do we start to harmonize capital flows into creating life-giving habitat?
Let's just track back a little bit to big systems. So if I look at really big systems that you would want to play with, food systems, energy systems, financial systems, built environment, education. It would be very easy to say that if you could change any one of those, you'd be flying. But we are effectively trying to change all 5 of those really together. And there are, of course, others, but those are, some of the biggest. But if we look at the built environment, which is, where we started this question, there are a couple of things that are really important to think about. So, Really Regenerative has been participating in one of the projects that's in the new European Bauhaus program that is funded by the EU Horizon project, in which is another organization called Dark Matters Labs. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dark Matters. And as part of the Desire project, which we're working on, they have produced a draft economic discussion paper for the built environment that looks at many different things, but in particular focuses on the impact of new housing, building new housing across Europe. And, it's always good to have inflammatory statistics when you're in a discussion, but this particular statistic really is something to sort of think about, which is if you look at existing net zero targets across Europe and you look at the average emissions across an average new build 3-bedroom house, to achieve existing net zero targets in European economies, you could build no more than 140,000 houses a year. The UK's new government's target is 300,000 a year alone. And okay, we're not in the EU anymore, but that gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge just affecting emissions, which is not the whole of the change that we want to make from the built environment. So when we look at the built environment, we're just thinking about new build housing. What's the potential of a different approach that could also mobilize the funding required that is bubbling up and emerging in different places of the world at the moment, but is to think about the built environment in the context of a bioregional scale. So what needs to happen across many different forms of economic systems is some form of re-regionalization of economic strategy from the globalized economy that we work on. Now, if we're being practical, most of us know that is not entirely transforming the global economic system overnight or even in the next 10 or 20 years, but is seriously looking at how you re-regionalize some parts of economic strategy. So if you take the built environment is a really enormous opportunity, as are food systems, to say, how, if we transformed our approach to house building or construction, could that be part of forming new biomaterials-based economies that would strengthen regional economies, that would enable the kind of innovation investment to take place in technologies that would assist the growth of biomaterials-based economies so that house builders could source products with a much less environmentally detrimental impact at a regional, local level, which could in part perhaps be financed by regional financing facilities. That feels like very much, in the future at the moment, but it is a very real design option to think about. There are projects emerging, I think, in many different geographies, in Australia, in Asia, in the US, Canada, Europe, that are really looking at, what does even a small pilot test of that theory look like? WWF, as an organization, which is an NGO, carried out a lot of interesting experiments in Australia during the post bushfires and early pandemic years, looking at the potential to integrate their ecological aims with economic and cultural systems. That's also being replicated in the UK. I think in addition to that, that is important to sort of think about in the context of the built environment. And that is something I would describe as centers. So one of the things that I have noticed is that transformative change in economies, cultures, and ecology that happens well from place, almost always somewhere in its trajectory, has a built environment center at its heart. So if I take a place in the UK in South Devon, which you may or may not have heard of, South Hams, many decades ago, a place called Dartington allowed a man called Satish Kumar to set up an educational institution there called Schumacher College, which has as a center of regeneration had enormous impact on the potential of the regenerative culture and learning to arise. In that place where Schumacher College was subsequently born the Transition Towns movement. So the Transition Towns movement could never have arisen without that physical institution first being there. And now there is a very live and thriving bioregional project and experimentation happening there that also grew out of that cultural scaffolding, shall we say. If I look at the US and I think about the movement that Martin Luther King led, that was deeply supported through Baptist churches, a built environment, piece of construction with strength of community attached to it. There is also a really interesting book that you might have read called The Nordic Secret, which has been documented also by Professor Joseph Bragdon up at Harvard. But looking at how the Nordic economies changed their economies during the early part of the 20th century, from poor agrarian societies to the social democratic powerhouses of the mid to late 20th century. One of the many key strategies that they put in place were folk schools, again, built environment structure, where people could spend maybe up to 9 months for over 6 decades exploring their own moral compass, their sense of belonging to place, how that their service to place would manifest in their village, town, city, how that would manifest in service of the nation, and how their nations would manifest in service to the world. So there's something really important about built environment structures that can hold the space for transformative education, learning, cultural development, ecological experimentation. And I think Donella Meadows was one of the first people in her paper about the Ballerton Group that imaged that in her mind and called them bioregional learning centers. So there can be centers, physical centers of all kinds. But one of the things that we are seeing increasingly in our research is how housing, which, very much in a European context, started in Denmark through the co-living housing movement, how rethinking how housing and the relationship to landowners and the relationship to ownership of housing and how we look differently at finance from your standard mortgage debt trap that holds societies locked in for many decades, which disables their potential for change, could be another catalytic shift in this ontological leap. I hope some of that made sense.
No,
It
this
may
is
not
brilliant.
have.
Yeah, no, it certainly does, because this is the pool in which we swim in through all these tentacles of creating acupuncture points through the built environment. And I've really had to settle on a different vocabulary of human sculpted environment, because you realize that it's not just the physicality of a building, but more of the patterns in which we design our civilizations, that includes agricultural lands, natural lands, forests, towns, and cities. It's one and the same. And it can either go towards extraction or towards regeneration, I guess, towards holism. And that is really where I think my life's work up to this point to lead us here to this show is really exploring of how do we redesign and work with those patterns, those deeper patterns, and work with communities to be the process work to create what needs to come out, rather than saying just we need this kind of a building that's going to have decarbonization embedded within it. And that's the really fascinating thing, and the deeper work that I really see, the thread in which you talk even about the Schumacher Institute and Satish Kumar, that it's part of this longer process and lineage, starting with definitely before Schumacher wrote Small is Beautiful, to then enable these successive iterations. And I'm really glad that you bring up a lot of different examples from in the built environment, because we've gotten resistance over the past 4 years of how can you put together regeneration and real estate as a term. And I come at it from a very different direction of like, how can you not put those two terms together?
Well, no, and I agree with you, but it is potentially, I would say, the most challenging environment to work in, simply because the rewards within it, the financial rewards within it, have been so significant. If you can own land and build infrastructure in our current culture, and if you can participate in being a constructor of that built environment, the financial rewards are significant. And yeah, that power makes transformation possibly more challenging. I don't know if that's true or not. That's my sense, that it's more challenging, but the potential, if you can get it right, is therefore correspondingly significant. And like all transformations, what it needs is resource for experimentation, which is why despite anybody that's participated in an EU funded Horizon project might whinge on about the incessant paperwork and reporting that's part of that. But there also comes with it a privilege to experiment in a funded environment. And I can't speak too highly of that. And I think if we genuinely want to bring regeneration into a built environment context, the only way in which to carry out the necessary experiments, they are iterative experiments. We have to work in that way if we want to make regeneration real. The only way to do that currently is to find billionaires with deep pockets who have heard a little bit about regeneration and are quite happy to experiment with you. But that has no social justice or equity or anything like that attached to it. And even though there are way many more billionaires than there ever were before, that doesn't seem like a sensible path to go down to me. So that means that some other form of finance needs to fill that gap, whether that's family offices, governments, collectives of people, or philanthropic funds. But, I believe, I don't know what you have in the US, but the participation in the EU Horizon New European Bauhaus project has convinced me that funding for experimentation in the built environment doesn't have to be huge, but it's still generally more sizable than most forms of experimentation. That we need more environments like that where we can have the funding and resource and people and build capacity as we do it to experiment in small ways where we can find the right kind of built environment infrastructure to work with. So in a town called Arles in France is an amazing project called Luma, which is funded entirely by the Maya Hoffman Foundation. And she is from Arles, unsurprisingly, where she initially funded the regeneration of some ancient, I believe, railway sidings and built structures, warehouses, to create a cultural centre that has now grown its impact over a number of decades to being ready and experimented deeply with materials within its particular region. What are the materials? What's the potential for a shift from more toxic materials in the built environment to more biomaterials-based economy? But the icon of restoring those buildings as centers for cultural exhibitions, art experimentation, regenerative enterprise experimentation, as well as starting to look at a wider materials-based economy is really powerful. But again, funded by a single individual with a particular relationship to that place. But boy, it would be great to see more of those around Europe and the world.
And I'd love to just talk to the audience right now, because this has been the theory of change that we've really been going on, which is around that this doesn't have to be a global center that is funded by a billionaire or by a philanthropist. That I think you can create life-giving habitat at your home. And we have so many examples of people that are saying, you know what, I don't want a lawn. I want to create a polycultural place that showcases that life can thrive underneath even the marginal soil that we've inherited in our cities because we've just paved it over or put in grass. We can make decisions to, not get that chemical input, but to do something a little bit more life friendly on life. And we can create art and we can gather community and in so many different beautiful ways. But you're right. We need all of it. And that's why I say we need the philanthropist to, we also need to work with capital that is locked away in pension funds and in insurance companies and in private equity.
I think of it as smooth capital that needs to a three, you might be able to prove a case in 3 years, but you then need that to extend into a further 10-year funding process. But I'm really encouraged to see that there is a lot of interest from what I guess I'd call family offices who have a bit more freedom than pension funds to choose what they do with their money. And, change always happens at one strata and one level first. And that level of potential has more freedom than pension funds, has more freedom than perhaps finance that emanates out of our existing financial structures. And I'm all for going for the low hanging fruit in times of emergency. But there is also, I think we underestimate as citizens, and it is because we have been in cultures that have suppressed agency and individual capacity to take agency and innovate. I think, to speak to what you were saying earlier, people are kept so busy and so stretched that they have no energy at the end of the day to get together with a group of neighbours and say, how about we replace all our paved over drives with food farms? They're just knackered at the end of the day. But there are two parts of society that are not knackered, which are the retirees and the very young. The very young have energy and they give a flying fish cake about the future because it's their future. And actually the elderly have funds because they generally tend to be baby boomers with nice fat pension funds, and they have time. And I think we have completely disregarded the potential relationship between the young and the old, because the squeezed middle, those people that are caught in the corporate trap of go to work, pay a mortgage, get the kids to school, pay the bills, oh God, there's not enough money, it doesn't stretch, are so overwhelmed. But these two groups are not. And if I had time to do all the experiments in the world, I would be very curious about the potential of putting those two groups together to see what could be realized.
This is what led us into really using the frame of legacy. And it's interesting that you have a background in brand strategy, because I think that's like, if you're talking with family offices, that is a message that we try to deliver, that this isn't just about like, how do you optimize your portfolio for maximum economic return? Like, you have to be able to work with that. But what is the legacies that we're leaving? And can we create living legacy? So anyways, that's just looking under the hood of really how we've been experimenting with the language of like what compels people into this field.
I think it may have been the wonderful Bill Reed who described three different types of people who bring significant funding into this environment. One of them was legacy builders. Another type of people, I suppose, were green enthusiasts, starting to see that green alone did not have enough potential, but they had some enthusiasm for ESG or sustainability that could be tapped into. And, then there is always that, that I suppose you would still call them legacy builders that come with an overlarge ego out of the built environment, wanting to build legacy from a perspective of totems that can potentially be converted into thinking of it more holistically and more co-mutually. I wish I could remember the three ways in which he described.
Yeah, Bill has been on a couple times, and he's been a keynote at an annual gathering that we host. It'd be great if Zoom could phone a friend right now. But I'd love to transition now, Jenny, just into the programs that you're offering with Really Regenerative. Is this for mainly European cohorts? Are you looking at global corporations and organizations to go on these learning journeys with you? What does that look like?
Well, we do have people from all over the world, subject by and large to time zone that in which we can run them. So we've had people from almost 30 different countries around the world participate, from the US, certainly, Canada, Europe, definitely, Turkey, Ethiopia, even. We're seeing an enormous uptick in interest from Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia right now, which is really fascinating. And it's so interesting to see the speed with which, particularly in Thailand, they are able to grasp and understand the potential of regenerative design, particularly also bioregional design. And I do think that probably has something to do with, local culture. The former king in Thailand had a policy called the sufficiency economy. So there is a sense to which that idea is already embedded in the culture. So that's really exciting. And in fact, actually on Power of Place last week, we were having a discussion about, we're always thinking, gosh, should we just design them as national programs? Because, to bring a global cohort together, you end up doing these programs in English. And there's something horribly colonial about that expectation that everybody should be able to learn and do these programs in English. And though I speak a few languages, I don't speak anywhere near enough. But there is something enormously rich about bringing an international cohort together in learning across different cultural backgrounds and experience, across different economies. There's something really deeply rich about it that we haven't wanted to give up, to go and to translate and go national, although we are looking at translating into Spanish currently. But, that's where I'm quite hopeful of technology. I started using, I'm a technophobe. I'm not very good at technology, but I started using a simple AI note taker this year. And it's been a revelation. I'm old enough to remember what it was like to have a secretary, and it's like having a secretary back. It's amazing. So we are hopeful of perhaps getting some funding to test out using AI in multiple instant translations so that everybody who comes to our cohorts can hear us speak in their own language. It might be really helpful, but there are always people within our cohorts who are from an academic educational background. And many of them have said, well, could we take Power of Place to Lithuania? Could we do Power of Place in Turkish in Turkey? And we completely encourage that because, you can only do so much as a tiny little organization called Really Regenerative in the UK. And that is another way in which our programs can spread. The other thing is we do constantly every year redesign them because every year the world evolves a little bit more. And what was new knowledge in 2023 needs more new knowledge in 2024. The thing that online learning in large global cohorts struggles to do, though we have found a lot of interesting ways to bring sacred space into an online environment and to bring embodied learning into an online environment. But it's much harder than learning together in person. That whole part of, we talk about this being a mindset shift, but it also that's just one part of the work. It also has to be embodied into practice. And that is something that is still, certainly at our level of skill, I'm sure there are other people around the world that are better at it, challenging to do online and better to do in person.
I applaud you for not letting that stop you, to say, look, we're going to bring people together, communities of practice, and we're going to work despite the circumstances. And hopefully, for a lot of people that are tuning into this, this is just another great resource that they can tune into and participate in if they haven't heard.
They will be very welcome. They will be very welcome. We tend to fly under the radar because we, having spent many decades in brand strategy, I have a peculiar allergy to self-promotion. So actually being on a podcast is really quite stressful for me.
Well, you've done brilliantly. Thank you, Jenny, for embracing that stress and coming on. It's a pleasure to learn more about your journey yourself and how you're showing up in the world and holding this complexity. And whatever metaphor we want to use of building the parachute as the plane is still, or rebuilding systems.
Parachute plane. Yeah, there are many very annoyingly mechanistic metaphors. I guess we just need to be a little bit more tree, maybe.
There we go. Yeah. And so for people that are tuning in, Jenny's organization is Really Regenerative. The Power of Place is these learning journeys. Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time to come on, and thank you for the work that you're putting out into the world.
Yeah, and thank you for shining a light on it. That is an important part of the shift, is having people who are prepared to host podcasts, tell people stories. Yeah, vital part of the work. So thank you also for everything you do too.
Okay, that is a wrap. Thank you for tuning into the show today. If you got any value out of this conversation, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss future episodes. I can honestly say that these conversations have changed my life, my business, and how I steward my own home. If you want to learn more about our work at Latitude, where we partner with property owners, developers, and stewards to create thriving communities and resilient habitats, then you can find us online at chooselatitude.com. Also, if you have a project that you are needing help bringing to life or would like to align your investment portfolio with profitable investment opportunities that benefit communities and the environment, then you can reach out to me directly at neil@chooselatitude.com, and we can start a conversation from there. Okay, that's it. Until next time, here's a friendly reminder that the water we drink falls from the heavens. The air we breathe comes from the beautiful symbiotic relationship we have with plants. The food that nourishes our bodies come from the ground we so cavalierly pave over, and that we all have a role to play to regenerate this planet.